Perfect. Then Dalit, Contini, and Guido Salza are both from the University of Trento.
No, I'm from the University.
Oh, sorry, of Turin. And the paper is Children Left Behind, New Evidence on the Negative Impact of Grade Repetition and Educational Careers. Dalit, Contini, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. What this paper is about is, this is an assessment. It's actually an attempt to evaluate the impact of grade retention on educational careers in Italian high school. And this is a joint work with Guido Salza from the University of Trento. Okay, so what is grade retention? Grade retention occurs when students who are poor performing are held back in the same grade for an extra year instead of moving along to the next grade with their classmates. So there is a large debate, public debate, and also in the scientific literature on grade retention as a remedial provision for tackling poor school performance. And the arguments in favor of grade retention refer to the fact that with having an additional year, students, poor performing students have additional time to fill the gaps. It is conceived as an incentive to elicit effort of the motivated students. And it's also useful to preserve the learning standards in the classroom. The cons are related to the fact that grade retention is a cost for the individual, is a cost for the society. Some refer to the stigma that is attached to the students who are being retained. And there is a concern over the possibility that grade retention will increase inequality. And this is also related to the fact that there is evidence that the disadvantaged social groups are far more exposed to grade retention. And this is on the one side because they are worse, they perform worse, but not only for this, because, for example, my co-author Guido Salza, with the same data that what we will now show, highlighted that even net of school performance, students from disadvantaged backgrounds are much more exposed to the risk of being retained. Sorry, there is something wrong here. Prima funzionava benissimo. This is not the right slide. I apologize. I tried before, so maybe I can just, okay. I will not, va bene così, no? Sono di nuovo uscita, sembra un'imbaranata. Ok, ma io farei, ok, io rimango così non c'è rischio di, perché prima è andato avuto. Ok, so we address the following research questions. What is the causal impact of grade retention on future schooling careers in Italian high school? And the second question is there evidence of different effects across social or demographic groups? So there is a large existing literature addressing this issue, but most studies focus on the US mainly, where retention is most often enforced in primary school. It's not this. Vabbè, scusate, avete pazienza. And the evidence actually is mixed. No, volevo mettere la modalità presentazione, ma non importa. No, non volevo uscire. Volevo solo evitare. Don't worry, it's not a problem. So the evidence is mixed. There are some studies, in particular, as compared to, for example, the timing. It seems that retention in primary school, sometimes studies report a beneficial effect, a positive impact on achievement, although less favorable results are instead found for later stages of schooling. But then it seems that the advantage, if any, tend to vanish over time. Some studies in the literature focus on the effect of retention on later achievement, while others focus on other outcomes, like, for example, psychological outcomes, and others focus on future educational careers and track choices. The context is also relevant. As I said, most studies have been carried out in the US, and these results seem to be more positive in the US than in Europe, but this might also be due to the fact that in the US, retention is mainly enforced in primary school, whereas in Europe, it is more common in secondary school, at least in some countries. Now, there are a few studies in Europe, and this, to the best of our knowledge, no studies in Italy. So what data do we use? We have linked the data of the National Register of Students, which provides information on the school paths, teacher marks, demographic information. And the data release we have covers school years between 2013-14 to 2016-17. And it's the entire population data of 3 large northern regions, Piedmont, Lombardy, and Veneto. And with the help of INVALSI, we have been able to link the data of INVALSI data, therefore, on standardized test scores and socioeconomic background. And we were also able, given that the fact that these data are, they're clustered into schools and classes, to have the information on school and class contexts. So in the study, we have a very large data set, more than 120,000 students entering secondary schools of these northern regions in 2014-16. So basically, we have, this is the first year of high school, and we study retention in 9th grade. And we have some information on what happened in middle school, so in grade 8. And then we follow these students for 2 school years. In this grade, the number of promoted students was over 100,000 students, and the number of retained students was nearly 18,000. So this is a very large data set and very rich, because we have several performance measures, teacher marks in Italian, math, and behavior, and standardized test scores. And these are performance measures that actually measure different skills. So it's a very large, important array of performance measures. We control for family background in terms of parental education and migration background, and we have information on the school context in terms of the type of school educational program and student body composition, both in terms of ability and social and ethnic composition. So a snapshot on the picture in grade retention in Italian school. It is barely existent in primary school. It's there are only low shares of retained students in middle school, but the share really jumps in high school. This is the data for the later school year, 2018-19. Overall, in 9th grade, 12% of the children are being retained. And there are differences across school tracks. So it is particularly salient to study grade retention in Italy in high school. So what is the analytical strategy? We want to identify the causal effect of grade retention. So basically, for those who are familiar with this literature, we want to estimate the average effect of the treatment, and the treatment here is retention, on the treated. So basically, we want to compare the situation for the students who are exposed to retention to a sound counterfactual. So to the situation these students would to their outcomes if they were not, if they had not been retained. And it's not so easy to do so, because on average, retained students are obviously less performing than promoted students. So the empirical strategies actually depend on the institutional context. When in some countries and in some areas, for example, of the United States, the promotion is based on a test scores. And so the rule is quite strict, transparent, there's no discretion. And in this case, these studies actually use regression discontinuity design. Or in other countries, the evaluation exploit policy changes, but this is not the case for Italy. We cannot do this for Italy. Instead, by exploiting this very large and rich database, we can use matching strategies. And there are many papers in the literature that, not in Italy, but that have used matching strategies, although with much, much smaller sample sizes. And this is a problem. So before moving to exactly how we proceeded, it is important to have some knowledge on how the grade retention decision is taken. At the end of the school year, teachers recommend a mark in their own discipline, and they gather together in the Consiglio agli Scrutini. And so to be promoted, students must obtain at least a grade of 6 out of 10 in each subject, including behavior. So in case of poor results, the national guidelines say that the teachers must take into account the chances that the students will be able to meet the expected goals by the end of the year. So there is a considerable degree of discretion in the decision. Now, this teacher discretion has two implications. One is a good implication, and the other one is a bad implication. The good implication is that discretion implies that we can find actually identical students, one in the two groups, one retained and one promoted. And this because this provides theoretical ground for matching strategy. There is what we call the common support. We can find students who are performing exactly the same, but one is being retained and the other one is being promoted. The bad implication is that if teachers wish to promote a student that actually does not display fully satisfactory records, they can to some extent adjust the grades and, for example, give a 6 instead of a 5. So end of the year marks at the time of retention are to some extent, they're being adjusted, so they are endogenous. You cannot use them to match students because you will never find a proper match. So we have to rely on previous measures of performance. So basically, if this is the grade 9, here the retention decision is taken based on the performance at the end of grade 9, but the performance that the teachers look at, it's not the grades, it's something different. And then we observe the outcome is the school trajectory. So instead of using performance in grade 9, we have to use a previous measure of performance, and we use performance in grade 8, both in terms of grades and in terms of test scores. But this does have some drawbacks because in principle, the treated students, the students who are being retained could have had a lower progress in this short amount of time. Just to say that we believe that the literature exploiting matching strategies, they use previous performance, but they don't actually highlight the problem. They do not address the problem. They just ignore it. But this is a problem that basically is common to all the settings where there is a system like this. So we try to do something about it. We cannot really, we don't have the magic, but we try to do something. So how do we find two comparable students? Now, the literature shows that context matters. So we do not only want to match similar children, we also want to find similar children in similar schools. in similar contexts. So in principle, to exclude school confounding effects, the best match should be found within the same school. But in this case, it doesn't work, because assuming that the retention policy is defined, basically it's an approximation, but it's reasonable at the school level, within the same school, there should be a single threshold. So the children that are retained are performing worse than the children that are being promoted. So we cannot find a good match within the same school. So how do we find comparable students? We actually match children in grade 8, so in middle school, with the same observed characteristics in terms of ability composition, social composition, and so on, but with different degrees of severity. What is severity? We conceive severity as a school propensity to resort to retention as a remedial measure for poor school performance, net of other school characteristics. Now I will show how. And so basically, if you look at this student, these two students, this one and this one, they are in one school with the threshold mu1, and these students will be retained and this student will be promoted. But this guy over here, he's in a different school with a lower threshold. So he is above the threshold, and so he will be promoted. So these two students are actually comparable. Now, this idea also has another consequence, that it also adjusts to some extent for what we have seen before, the fact that we are looking at performance at the end of 8th grade instead of the end of a grade 9. So we are to some extent neglecting what happens in this school year. Because doing this, we actually, that is matching treated units in more severe schools with control units in less severe schools, we actually end up attenuating or even reversing the potential imbalance, at least in terms of observed performance measures. In fact, well, I will show you this later. Maybe I can show, no, I will show it later. So basically, what do? We use propensity score matching and perfect exact matching. And we can do this because of the very large sample size. So we do perfect matching in terms of course, we consider individual and school variables. In terms of individual, we can do a perfect matching in terms of age, parental education, migration background, and gender. And in terms of school variables, track and ability composition, almost perfect. Whereas when we want to consider performance measures, we use propensity score, while also controlling for school severity. So basically, what do? We estimate on the entire sample a two-level logistic model with school random effects. This is the propensity of being retained. These are individual characteristics, school characteristics, observed school characteristics, and this is a school random effect that we conceive as severity, school severity, and that we can estimate from this model. After this, we compute the expected retention probability, that is the propensity score for students with given individual and school characteristics, assuming a given level of severity. So basically, the search algorithm works as follows. For each retained student, we search for promoted students who share the same characteristics in terms of all these variables. Then, so we have a subset of possible controls. Then we select promoted students within an acceptable range of the propensity score, which is severity held constant, because we just estimated it for a given level of severity. And within this set of potential controls, we choose the promoted student as a match in the least severe school, provided that the severity level of the school of the control is lower than her own. Now, what are outcomes? We have, like, this is the year of grade retention, the treatment decision. We have performance measures in grade 8, and then we look at what happens at enrollment after possible retention after grade 9. Children might not enroll anymore. We might not see them anymore. They might have changed track, that is, go to a less prestigious track, let's say. They might change school, but remain in the same track, or they might remain in the same school. And at the end of the year, they might have dropped out during the year, or they might be promoted and retained. And this happens for 2 years, 2 following years. We also have results for all these single outcomes, but I just want to show you the pictures in terms of what we call the unconditional outcomes, which is a sort of a picture of what happens in the following 2 years. And we define the linear career if the students remain in the same schools or in a school with the same track and is always promoted thereafter. We call a downward change if the students moves to a lower track, for example, from lyceum to technical schools, but is always promoted thereafter. So it's bad, but not so bad. And the 2 negative outcomes that are being retained in the following years or being a dropout. Now I don't have time now, but if you are interested in what do we mean by dropout, we can talk about it. So if we look at how much time do we have? It's over.
No, still 10 minutes.
Really?
Yeah, because we have 2 hours.
Oh, okay. So this is the propensity score distribution before and after matching. This line over here is the propensity score distribution. Here there are all students, which means the probability of being retained for students who have not been retained. And as you can see, the majority of them has very, very low retention probability because they are well performing. And this is the distribution of the propensities, the probability of being retained for the students who have actually been retained. And in the match sample, we find that the propensity scores of treated and controls is basically, the distribution is basically the same. Now, we were able to match only 42% of the retained students. That is 7,000, more than 7,000 students. Is this a bad? No, we think this is very reasonable because the majority of students who are being retained are very poor performing, and it's not possible to find a similar student who has actually been promoted. So this is very reasonable. As I told you before, with this different severity matching, we actually in terms of observed performance, the treated group, that is the children who are being retained, actually have better performance measures than the controls, which somehow over-adjust for this possible different performance. And we prefer to have somehow this unbalanced because our idea is, okay, if we find a detrimental effect, which actually we do, I will show you in a minute, we want to be sure that it's not an effect due to the fact that promoted students are doing better than retained students. We prefer to underestimate the negative effect of grade retention rather than not being able to disentangle whether it is a real effect or a spurious effect. So moving to the results, these are average treatment effects, but actually, since we have not matched everybody, but just 42% of the sample, we conceive it as a local average treatment effect. That is, we are basically comparing similar students, so the students who are not so poorly performing, but are being retained, with the poor students who are similar, but have been promoted. So what is the probability of a linear career? That is, everything that remain in the same school, they are promoted thereafter. These are the students who have been retained, the treated. They have a 37% probability of experiencing this kind of outcome. Whereas control students who have been promoted have a probability of almost 70%. The difference is huge. If you look at the downward, since we have time, I can also show you what happens for the probability to move downwards. This is like 20% for the treated and 2% for the controls. So even in this case, the probability is, the difference is very large, although one can argue that if the children experience a downward change, but then they are always promoted, that, well, this is not so bad. Maybe they have moved to the best schools for them. So we can conceive this as a bad outcome, but not so bad. The probability of being retained is 16% for the children who have already been retained and 24 for the children who have not been retained. So in this case, the difference is in favor of the children in the treated group, because if you were flunked 1 year, it's difficult that you will be flunked one more time. Whereas if you look at the dropout probability, the probability is 26% for the group of the treated and 4% for the group of the control. Huge difference. The risk ratio is 6 times as much. Here we have some, I don't know if you can see this very well, but some exploration on the heterogeneity of the effects by parental education. We find something not, for example, the probability, the effect to, the probability to experience a linear career, which is a good outcome, the differences between these 2 points, these are the children in the control group, these are the children in the treated group, and the distance between these 2 points is the effect. And the effect is much smaller for children who, maybe this is wrong, but for children from the tertiary, who have tertiary educated parents. So if children who are in, who have well-educated parents are being retained, they suffer less. This is instead the outcome for the dropout, and even in this case, the effect of experiencing a dropout is worse for the students who are in the more disadvantaged backgrounds. And we also find something in terms of migratory status. The citizens, Italian citizens, experience a lower disadvantage, lower effect than migrant students. So what are our conclusions? That grade retention negatively affects subsequent educational outcomes by increasing dramatically, in particular, the dropout probability. There is some evidence that the negative effects are stronger for students from disadvantaged backgrounds who, as the literature has shown, and even the literature using the Italian data, actually the same data, who they are also much more likely to be retained. So we can conclude that retention is ineffective, costly. This is not, I put it in parentheses because it's not a conclusion that we draw from our study, but it is costly and has important consequences on inequality. Thank you.